Well, actually, 1 John 5 kind of repeats what that says, so it's sort of just a redundant reminder of the call of God to love and to share, to bear fruits as the primary call of what the gospel calls us to do. This morning, I want to start by taking you back a few years. I don't remember if you remember when the Da Vinci Code came out. It's like a lot of other things in our culture. It had a lot of commotion and controversy, etc. when it came out, and probably most of us have totally forgotten about it by now. But it raised some interesting questions about the relationship of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And really the primary pieces of those kind of centered around two things. One was that Jesus was not only married, but a parent, which actually, when you think of it as we're having Mother's Day today and celebrating parenthood and the joy of having children and sharing them, doesn't seem like such a bad thing. It's kind of interesting that that raises so much controversy. Of course, there's no scripture that says yes or no. It just doesn't really mention that. But of course, the real issue was whether or not Jesus was more divine or more human, which is actually something that people throughout the centuries of the church have been debating, whether or not the divine aspect of Jesus was the most important issue, or whether it was the fact that Jesus was human that was the most important part of the idea that God actually came and to become a human being. And depending upon the time and culture and the issues of that day, if you look back and read a lot of Christian history, which one is the emphasis changes from time to time. And the thing I want you to think about, though, is how we get into these issues about who Jesus was and maybe forget what Jesus' message was. And we see both, as I mentioned, 1 John and John sort of push a similar message. 1 John, the passage we didn't read, mentions that we are all children of God. So he moves past this idea of being servants, but being children. So even as we think of Mother's Day and our relationship to God, our relationship to our mother, the scripture reminds us that we're supposed to have that same relationship with God as children, not as servants, not as workers, but as those who carry on the inheritance of God. We're supposed to believe that Jesus was born of God, and we're supposed to follow God's commandments. That's what 1 John says. Now, of course, what the commandments are is somewhat debatable in terms of exactly where the focus of that is. We can go back and look at the Old Testament scriptures. We can look at what Jesus teaches in his life and work. But it all ultimately comes down to that passage that that the Gospel of John underlined. And it's not the only place it's mentioned. I mean, this is not a new thing to say, that the first commandment is to love God and to love one another. We're called to love one another and to be more than servants, but in this passage it says to be a friend of God, a friend of Jesus, which is not quite as strong as 1 John's call to be children. But all of it is talking about an intimacy of relationship that we're called to have with God, not as following a group of rules from some dictator or even some king in the old way of looking at that, but to actually be a part of the family plan of serving God. And ultimately that is to bear fruit, to change the world by the way we live our lives. We can spend a lot of time on the non-consequential issues, as you remember when that was such a controversy over the Da Vinci Code. Whole churches got in an uproar and had debates and challenges on that. What is the nature of Jesus? And forgot to ask the question, what is Jesus calling us to be? What is Jesus calling us to become as followers, as disciples? And so we're called not to just preach piety being that sort of separate sense of being in prayer a lot and feeling very holy, but not necessarily going out into the world. I ran into this little story about the strange ways people can get caught up in their own message and then lose the point. Pastor Marshall Wenderburn, who was from Kitchener, Ontario, got a conditional sentence and probation by the court on 1st of June when he admitted that he had whipped his 11-year-old daughter in church with a microphone cord because she did not appear to be paying attention to his sermon. So we have to ask who wasn't paying attention to his sermon, because apparently he wasn't either. And we get caught up in that point of getting so full of ourself and the message, we forget how we're supposed to act. Now, we look at Mother's Day, we might also look at Mother Teresa as an image of what we are called to be. Remember, it's only been fairly recently, I think about maybe a year ago, that some of her diaries came out that talked about her uncertainty about faith, her uncertainty about her understanding of God. And I've had some people ask me about that. Well, what do we do with that then? Because we kind of looked up to Mother Teresa. And my answer to that, is she admitted her struggle. And the point is that while she may have not understood theologically who God was, her life illustrated who God was. She offered her life for others. She might have struggled with this sense of who God is in her life, but she acted for God in her life. So the issue is not where, I know this sounds different than all those speakers that say it. First of all, it's about belief. You can wrestle with belief, but how do you live your life? You can have firm belief, not so firm belief, but how do you live your life? And either way, could be ways you live it actively, but it's in the fruit, ultimately. I read this little thing. I can't remember where I picked this up, but I found this a few years ago, which makes this comment about this call to what it is to be a faithful person or to live your life well in any way. It says, people are often unreasonable, illogical, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, people may accuse you of being selfish, ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you are successful, you shall win some false friends and some true enemies. Succeed anyway. If you are honest and frank, people may cheat you. Be honest and frank anyway. When you spend years building, someone could destroy overnight. Build anyway. If you find eternity and happiness, they may be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good you do today, people will often forget tomorrow. Do good anyway. Give the world the best you have, and it may never be enough, but give the world the best you've got anyway. We are called to make the world a different place in our lives. That's what Christ calls us to do, to live his example, to change our lives from ones of fear and hopelessness to ones of making a difference, changing lives. There's a story, this sounds like could have been me driving along with my kids one day, but Dad was driving along in a nice sunny day, kind of like we're having now, driving along the Lord, just minding his own business, enjoying the weather, and he must have been going a little too slow because his kids suddenly, as they were driving along, spotted a poor little stray cat along the side of the road. They said, Daddy, there's a cat on the road back there. You need to go stop. He looked horrible. You have to go back and pick him up. He said, no, we can't stop for every stray cat. We see we're on a nice, pleasant drive. Oh, Daddy, he'll die if we don't go back. Well, animals die all the time. That's just the way it is. We've got so many animals in the house anyway. I'm going to go back and pick up another stray cat. Well, this went on for a little bit until finally the authority in the car said, that was the wife, said, dear, you better go, the mother, it's the Mother Day, I should say the mother said, you need to go pick up the cat. So he turned around, he says, you guys stay in the car, I'll go get this cat. So he goes over and here's this poor little cat barely able to move because he's so scrawny and hungry and frightened and looking very much flea-bitten and just, he wasn't real sure he wanted to touch him, but he knew he didn't want his kids to. And he reaches down, and that cat, with his last bit of strength, hissed at him and swung out with claw to grab hold of him. Probably would have done more damage, but he was too weak. But he was just in fear and anger. He lashed out at the father, who finally got a hold of him with a scratch or two on his hands and got him into the car and took him home and said, now, we can put him in the house today, but tomorrow he's going to find a home in the garage. Well, you know how that ended up. So they took him in and they gave him a bunch of baths and they gave him plenty to eat and food and created him this great. In fact, he said, you can put it on the edge of my bedroom. They made him this nice little bed in Mom and Dad's bed. And of course, that became the cat's home. And a few weeks later, the dad was walking into the room again, and he suddenly felt this furry, moving animal rubbing up against his leg, asking to be petted. And he reached down and looked to make sure no one was looking, picked the cat up and began to pet him. But what changed that cat from when he picked him up the first time, when he spit, to the cat now reaching out and saying, "Love me, love me"? Well, the story tells itself. When we reach out to the stray cats of the world and give them love and compassion, they respond in kind. And the world changes. The world is transformed. So transformation of the world, making a change, is not about these big things. It's often reaching out with that compassionate, loving hand at a time when people need to hear that sense of being cared about. Now, moms, of course, as we have our Mother's Day, moms, of course, teach us a lot about what kind of cat we are and how we react to other cats. It's appropriate to remember, I think, this morning that God calls us to learn how to mother others. Now, when I thought of saying that, I know there's a negative aspect of being too mothering. It's a smothering is really what people mean by that. But mostly when we think of the word of, if we would treat everyone else like our mothers treated us, the world would be a world, that would be the gospel. That would share the gospel. That unconditional love that sees a person who needs to be lifted up, supported, cared for, loved, hugged, whatever. Because that's what moms do. They just see whatever needs doing and they do it. And sometimes that means a little discipline, a little authority. But almost even then, it's always with a hug and a kiss